Okay, so welcome to another one of our little podcasts. This is Hugh Waters, and over there is young Phil Crawley, and we're going to be talking about colorimetry. It's a topic which has really touched us over the years. My career started at a little company called Telecine Limited. Guess what we did? Transferring film. And in those days, we didn't really think about colorimetry other than, can it look fairly nice on this monitor? But from those early days, it began to become very important. And it's a subject that we often hear bandied around, but what does it really mean? Phil, over to you, I think.
It's something that I mean, me having started at the BBC were very hot on colorimetry, but from the point of view of fidelity. So that the production, pointing a television camera at somebody in a studio or somebody on location, all the way through the post-production process, which might involve a grade, to produce a particular colour look, or I worked in television news, so it was all about producing fidelity through the whole process, all the way through to the viewer. That particular colour of red or whatever that you saw on set, that you saw on the location, should be faithfully reproduced all the way through. And similarly, for more creative television or film, that particular look that the director or the DOP or the lighting cameraman's after, he needs to be assured that's going to work all the way through to the viewer. I mean, with some caveats. Obviously domestic televisions aren't set up as calibrated displays in the same way that the monitors that we deal with in television are, but a consistency all the way through and a standard that can be checked at certain points in the chain. You often hear that cry, don't you? It wasn't that colour in the Telecine suite. As it was coming off film, as we were transferring it to videotape, it looks a different colour in the edit suite. And there are well-established principles which aren't hard to take hold of as an engineer, to know how to manage that colour process all the way through, from the on-set or the in-studio camera all the way through the post-production process to delivery.
And I think today it's probably even more important than it was back then, in that everybody's a cameraman. Now that you've got a digital camera, most people have got some way of manipulating the pictures and the colours, and I think more people understand what a colour should be. And given what a commercial world we live in, the pack shot has to be the right colour. And logos are just so. So perhaps people are more tuned into it than they were.
There's a very famous example where Vodafone was sponsoring an event on Sky. This is a couple of years ago, and Vodafone's obviously their livery is that particular red shade, and because at the time Sky were broadcasting directly off HDCam SR, so the HD feed, and they were taking the down converter out of the VT without paying much attention to the 601/709 colour space difference, and so all standard definition viewers were getting a slightly colour incorrect version of the signal, which of course, who is Vodafone's biggest competitor? It was the boards in and out of each ad break were arriving at the standard definition viewer's home, very much an orange colour rather than the Vodafone red. So it has kind of commercial implications, because I believe Vodafone pulled their support of the event, and large amounts of money were lost. And you say nowadays that everybody's a cameraman, or rather, somebody who was a runner 2 weeks ago is the second camera, clutching a Z1 or something else this week, and that wasn't always the way. Lighting cameramen would previously have had 10 years training as an assistant and worked their way up. That's in a lot of trades in our area. But one thing that's worth pointing out is all our equipment is RGB internally. A camera acquires pictures in the RGB space. Digital video workstations, effects machines, computer graphics workstations, they all generate things in the RGB domain. And then we have to deal with, for the most part, things being transcoded into YUV colour space. And there are things to look out for in that. But I suppose, to start off with, if we're going to talk about colorimetry and the kind of things that the engineers need to know about, we need to talk about how human vision works. And I've just got up on screen now a electromicrograph picture of a section of the retina. And,
oh yes.
And you may know that the retina is composed of these two different kinds of cells. There's the rods, which are dyed green in this image. I think it's just to highlight the difference. I don't think in reality they are green. I mean, they're kind of microns across. They're tiny little things. they're the rods, which look like little rods, and there are the cones, which have a more sort of tapered end to them. And the rods are sensitive to broad spectrum light, and the cones are sensitive to certain sets of wavelengths. And so at that point, it's worth kind of, I suppose, pressing the pause button and saying, just what does that mean? Well, sunlight is a mixture of wavelengths in the electromagnetic spectrum. So like radio waves, like microwaves, like lots of other forms of electromagnetic energy. Light is just another example of that. And typically, human vision extends from about 400 nanometers up to 700 and something nanometers. Obviously, different people have got different ranges of perception. And
I've got that on my ruler here. You see, 7 nanometers. It's quite small. I don't know if you can see
very,
it.
very wee, yeah. That's a high quality ruler. But so they're the range of wavelengths that the human eye is sensitive to, and obviously different creatures are sensitive to different sets of wavelengths. Dogs tend not to see down into the blue end of the spectrum and see much further up into the red end of the spectrum and up into the infrared end of the spectrum that we can't see. And I believe other creatures have got different sort of sight responses to us. But whereas the electromagnetic radiation that's emanating from the sun, in the visual band, as well as kind of further on up and further down below, is pretty broadband. It's pretty consistent across the whole band. If you point a receiving antenna at the sun, at whatever wavelength you tune to, you just hear a vast amount of noise. Similarly, if you look at the sun, you see very bright white light, and that's indicative of the fact that there's a complete mix of wavelengths coming from the sun. Now, our eyes are not what they call a broadband receiver. Our eyes actually are typically sensitive. Well, so from a colour point of view, they're sensitive in 3 regions. There's the blue cones. So let's go back to our picture of the rods and the cones. Some of those cones are sensitive to light, with a peak around about 450 nanometers, and we'll refer to those as the blue cones because they're sensitive to light in that blue part of the spectrum, with sort of tailing off right the way down to 550 nanometers and probably right the way down to 350 nanometers at the other side of their peak. And then we've got another set of cones, we'll call them the green cones. They're sensitive to light, sort of centered around about 550 nanometers and tailing off with a broader shoulder on that curve. And then crazy stuff goes on with the red cones because they're centered around about 600 nanometers and they tail off down to 500 nanometers and 700 nanometers. But then there's this crazy little kind of peak that comes back up again around about 450 nanometers. So, light entering your eye at the 450 nanometer wavelength, which we'd call blue, is not only is it tickling the blue cones, it's also to a degree tickling the red cones as well.
Yeah.
And there are huge areas of overlap where you've got sort of all 3 sets of cones being tickled, and other areas where only one set of cones is being tickled. And so obviously this is the way God made your eyes, and it's ideally suited, if you're out on the savannah watching out for that lion who might be coming after you, and it works very well in nature. Increasingly, the kind of things we see on television, particularly those very heavily graded shows, look as if they didn't really come from nature. But that's really the way your eyes set up. And
it's interesting, just before we go on, we always talk about, and we will be talking about red, green and blue, but in fact, your eye doesn't really see those colours as accurately as that. And it's more sort of greens and browns, really, but we interpret it that way.
That's right. If you look at those curves, you kind of think to yourself, well, any sensible kind of visual pickup system would have those 3 curves equally spaced across the band, and you'd be able to see things, at different wavelengths with equal amounts of perception. But the truth of the matter is, there's not very deep blue in nature. You don't often see very blue things in nature, and so it is more important that your visual acuity is around that 550 nanometer center green sort of band. But hey, your brain does a very good job of sorting this all out. And along with let's go back to the picture of the rods and the cones. The cones are about 4 times more dense on your retina than the rods are about 4 times more dense than the cones, so you have much higher resolution from those wideband black and white monochrome rods, if you will. They're the things that don't distinguish between colour at all. They only provide you with detail, and then the cones,
which on your peripheral vision are really handy for seeing movement, and also one of the reasons why at night don't look straight at something but look to one side of it, because it's the rods that are helping you there.
Yeah, and particularly if you wake up at night and it's very dark in your bedroom, you pretty much don't perceive very much colour at all, unless you've got like a red LED alarm clock or something. Pretty much you're only seeing detail in those very sort of dark greys. So your eye is ideally set up for seeing detail, in monochrome, and kind of painting an overall wash-in of colour over the top of that. So if we go back to the graphs of the sensitivity of the cones, one of the upshots of these kind of where the response curves cross over each other is that there are certain wavelengths that you can't tell the difference between. So look up here round about the sort of 670 nanometers. You've got red and green at certain values. There are other places on the graph where you can find red and green at exactly the same sets of values, and your brain does a very good job of interpreting that, and will often use a lot of contextual information. It knows that certain objects are never that colour, and so you're never kind of surprised to see that. But where you have those colours, which, because you've mapped a wideband light source, the sun, onto a tristimulus, as it's called, detection system, i.e. the retina in the back of your eye, you get certain sets of wavelengths which are indistinguishable from each other, and those things are called metamers, or you often hear the expression metameristic failure, where you can't distinguish between your two different sets of wavelengths under certain lighting conditions, and that metamerism is most kind of obviously and grossly expressed with people who have red-green colour blindness, where they've got huge metameristic failure. They can't distinguish between red and green. And looking at the graph, you can kind of see why. It wouldn't take very much going wrong with the red and the green cones for there to be almost no differentiation between them at all. And some people, and I believe it's a male thing. I believe it's a
very largely.
Genetically, it's men that suffer that, and so that's. That's kind of one of the failures of a tristimulus visual system. In fact, there's the famous Ishihara tests, which are done. I've popped up an Ishihara slide, which when I worked at the BBC, every year you had to go, and it's one of the tests they used to do every year to make sure your colour vision was still good, because the assumption was that. Go on.
It should just explain to people who might not be able to see anything except a grey blob.
Yes. Yeah, there should be the number 12 written in red characters inside this green circle, and it's used to detect whether you have red-green colour blindness. And you could be slung out. Not slung out, but you could have your job, your career path changed at the BBC in the late 80s, because they knew that you'd be no good sitting in a studio doing colour control on studio cameras. If you were starting to lose your colour vision, so that was something they were very hot on. So just think about that a little bit. We've said that mapping a wideband light response from the sun onto a tristimulus system, your eyes, produces these metameristic failures, wavelengths that can't be distinguished from each other because you're using just a red, green, blue pickup system to interpret a wideband light signal, if you will. Now the same is true of television cameras, whether they're tubed-based cameras, old school tubed-based television cameras, or whether they're more modern CCD cameras, or whether it's a very modern still camera that uses a CMOS device, or these very new digital film cameras like the Red or the Alexa. They all use tristimulus technology to pick up the images. And so they all, to varying degrees, suffer from metameristic failure. And the same is true of display devices. Whether it's an LCD monitor or an old school CRT monitor or a projector, a DLP projector, they all use RGB tristimulus display technology to make a full range, 450 up to 800 and whatever nanometer type output. Now, the reason why you get away with it is because the manufacturers are aware of what that tri-stimulus behaviour is. And I've just popped up the spectrum for CRT phosphors. And comparing that to the values for your eyes, you can see the blue curve is pretty good. It pretty well matches what your eyes are, and the green curve is very creditable. I mean, but the red of a CRT is all over the place. But so long as the manufacturers know that, they can apply weighting filters to the signal as it goes into the CRT to better match what's going to be perceived by your eye. And CRTs had the advantage of 50 years or more of development of the chemistry of the phosphors to better suit people's eyes. And with all that in mind, we kind of arrive at this idea of sort of a model of human vision that's best expressed by something called the 1931 CIE Chromaticity Chart, which I've just stuck up on screen. Now, let me slide down to, I have here the equations for deriving those values. Well, I thought I did. Anyway, let's go back to the image of the chromaticity chart. The chromaticity chart doesn't rely on red, green and blue values. It essentially derives little x and little y values based on red, green and blue, and an overall z value, which is the overall illumination of the scene. Now, this, if you're a TV engineer, this is starting to sound vaguely familiar, that you have two colour difference signals and an overall illumination signal. And they knew this back in the 1930s, before colour television was even thought of. And so by testing lots of people for their visual acuity, and by making measurements under sort of ideal and consistent conditions, the French physicists who worked out this diagram discovered that by representing colour on two axes, little y and little x, and then assuming that all those colours then have equal amounts of kind of colour triangles above and below them to represent different levels of deviation away from black, you have a very kind of usable model that shows the full range of human vision. Now,
I shall just.
It's the man from the CIE. He's phoned his complaint.
Yes, he should have gone out of the door. Right. Let's just. You can see.
So what I'm popping up on screen now is a Tektronix poster, which if you write to Tektronix or email them, they'll send you it, and it's fantastic. It's a really very good explanation of television colorimetry. So it's the same CIE diagram that I've got up, and overlaid on top of it is various gamuts for contemporary television systems. So you've got the NTSC colour space in red, and you've got EBU and Rec 709, which is the one, of course, we use in Europe, which is overlaid in blue, and then you've got SMPTE, which was an earlier American television standard, and is also was used a bit in film. But the ones we worry about are the red triangle and the blue triangle, which back in standard definition days, when you calibrated monitors, you were very aware of the fact that American monitors always looked a bit redder, and European monitors looked a bit bluer because you calibrated them to slightly different colour temperatures. Now that having used that expression, colour temperature, we can't really kind of gallop on without explaining that a little bit more. The colour temperature of something it's a bit of a kind of physicsy term. There's this idealised object in physics called a black body radiator, which if you heat the black body radiator, and I think the one that is a lump of iron, if you heat that to a certain temperature, past a certain temperature, everything glows at the colour temperature of the temperature you heated it to. So if you heat it up to 6500 Kelvin, which is blinking hot, iron melts at considerably lower temperature than that. It glows with a certain mixture of wavelengths, and 6504 Kelvin is the colour temperature that was chosen when the EBU were first defining European colorimetry for colour television as being our peak white point. In fact, they chose 6500 Kelvin, but in the 70s it was discovered that the Planck constant, which is a physical natural constant, had been slightly miscalculated. And so when you then recalculate the colour of peak white using the correct Planck constant, you actually get out 6504 Kelvin. So although everybody refers to what the white that we use for television nowadays is 6500, it's actually 6504 if you want to be a stickler. sometimes referred to as illuminant D. That's kind of a BBC
Yeah.
expression, and that merely describes the colour of white as used in television. Well, it's not just the colour of white; it's the colour of mid-grey and it's the colour of black. Well, that's kind of sounds nonsensical. The colour of black, black doesn't have a colour, but if you have a consistent colour temperature going all the way from the darkest blacks all the way up to peak white, then you know that your television system won't suffer colour changes, colour casts as the vision mixer fades up from black, as the cameraman zooms in on something and the illumination of the scene decreases. So that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for that consistent colorimetry with 6504 Kelvin as our reference white point. And kind of that's really where television colorimetry all starts and almost ends. There's not much more to it than that. For a long time, the Americans used 5500 as their peak white point, but when we all moved over to high definition, there was something of a unification in the world, and now 6504 is pretty much regarded as the white point for reference for standard definition television for PAL in Europe, and for high definition television worldwide, and film as well. As digital film workflows, DI processors have become the norm. 6504 has become the accepted white point standard, and that's not to say that DOPs and people who sit in grading suites don't grade to wildly crazy colours for white, but as a starting point to know if your monitor is the right colour, 6504 is regarded as the standard. So
it's probably just worth noting that on most TVs and modern TVs, and certainly a lot of computer monitors, you have a choice of white points that you can set your display to, which will make an interesting nonsense of whatever comes in.
Yes. Now,
it's just worth bearing in mind.
Having mentioned computer monitors, I get this all the time. Can I calibrate my computer monitor for use as a TV grading display? That's probably a question I answer every week, and the answer is no. And part of the reason for that is computer monitors, although nowadays they all have pretty standard and pretty accurate backlights at the 6504 colour temperature, because they're set up for use in bright offices or sold in showrooms or whatever. Their peak white point is set at about 400 candelas per metre squared. That's very typical for a computer monitor, or in fact a domestic television as well. But the peak white point we grade to in television, ideally you want to be setting a monitor for the peak whites to be at about 80 candelas per metre squared as the overall illumination standard. In fact, a lot of film guys now work to 60 candelas per metre squared because there's a saying that as luminance goes down, delta E, which is the just noticeable difference between two colours, increases. So if you really want to see the difference between those colours down there in the dark parts of the picture, you really want accurate colour performance off your monitor. 80 candelas per metre squared is now the preferred setup for people who are grading for film. 60 for film, 80 for television. To be honest, if you're kind of round those figures, you're kind of safe. The other thing I wanted to talk about, with colour, and I've just popped up the Wikipedia page about colour constancy and the Retinix theory, is it all comes back to an experiment that Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid camera, devised in the 1970s. And what he did was he got a warehouse, and on one of the inside walls of the warehouse, he had painted a Mondrian, blocks of colour, and then set up a lighting system so that he could light those blocks of colour, very desaturated sort of pastel colours, with very intense different coloured lights. And what he discovered was that if you can't see past the Mondrian that you're looking at, you can that fills your field of view, so you've got no external reference point. If you close your eyes, and he adjusted the lighting so that some of those very pastel colours were actually now being entirely illuminated to give an entirely different colour, actually your brain would perceive them as the same colour they saw previously, because your brain is a fantastic pattern matching machine. And this is kind of very well expressed by virtue of the fact that the difference in light levels between just as the sun's coming up in the dawn in the morning, or twilight in the evening just as the sun's going down, the difference in light levels between that and a bright midday is hundreds of times. You talk to any OB cameraman, and if they're obliged to work between those 2 times of the day, they will have to recalibrate their camera several times during the process of that. And a modern TV camera's got a good dynamic range, 80 dBs, how many stops that is, 12, 14 stops of light. But your eye does that. Your eye, in concert with your visual cortex, does that as a matter of course, and you're not even aware of it. You're not even aware that the green that you look at first thing in the morning as you leave your house, and the green you look at midday, the same colour, actually to a television camera will be wildly different. And that's the amazing thing about the human visual system. It's not just about the retina and picking up the image in the back of your eye, but it's about how that's processed and how your brain interprets that. And Land came up with this thing called the Retinex theory, where he almost implied that your visual system had memory, that it could easily track colour differences and present them to your brain as being the same, so long as it didn't have external references. Now, I've popped up a picture. It's the same photo, but it massively differently graded. The top picture is graded very green in both the black and the whites, and the bottom picture is graded very red in both the black and the whites. And your brain interprets that pink card, which I'm hovering the cursor over, as different colours. In fact, they're the same colour. If you got your eyedropper, Photoshop, and measured the colour of the pixels on this screen, they're exactly the same colour. And this is what's referred to as colour constancy. That your brain has this ability to match things very well and produce this thing called colour constancy. And this is very well expressed by something called the Bezel Defect. And I've got up a graphic which is a pair of gratings with a grey stripe that runs through them. And you look at the grey stripe on each side of the grating, and for all the world, on the left-hand side it looks a lot lighter than it does on the right-hand side. But hey, if you measure it, they're exactly the same.
Yes, I've not seen that before. Where did you get that from? I haven't seen that one.
I think I just googled for the Bezel Defect and nicked it from somebody. And in fact, the other picture I've just popped up is the one that's on the Wikipedia page, which again is the A and the B squares that you can see here. If you measure those, they're exactly the same colour grey. But you stare at it as long as you like. You try and convince your brain they're the same colour grey, and then visually they're not. But from a vision perspective point of view, when you're out on the savannah and you're worried about a lion coming to catch you, these are the things that matter. Television and film are relatively recent developments in human history, and it's not what the Almighty designed our eyes for, really. Which is why it makes proper colour management, from acquisition all the way through to delivery, an interesting kind of effect.
Yes, working with the imperfect is much more fun than just shuffling the perfect around. So
I'm just going to, really as a finisher, I'm going to pop up another graphic, which is the spectrum of contemporary LCD monitor. An LED backlit LCD monitor, and again that's got a certain colour curve to it, and you can see it's quite different to human vision, and it's quite different to a CRT. But again, it's the fact that manufacturers know this, and they can weight the colour values before they get displayed, so that it approaches something near your visual acuity, so that you get a faithful reproduction of colour range. So that's really kind of that's the groundwork I wanted to lay for human vision. You can't say too much about colour consistency because that's counterintuitive. People don't really believe it goes on. I remember once,
except that anybody who's ever bought themselves a camcorder, especially anybody that bought a camcorder in the past, would have known they had to do that white balance thing.
Yes, yeah.
Otherwise it didn't work.
That's right.
And do you know what? I have never yet done a white balance on my eyes.
Indeed, yeah. Well, your brain is constantly pressing the white balance button as you move your eyes about.
In fact, if you look outside, you can see the world is going blue.
Yes.
But I turn around and it's still green. It's not blue outside.
In that the few hundred milliseconds it took you to refocus, your brain did the right thing, and it's amazing. I heard about a friend at Channel 5 told me that they at one point they had allowed their editors to decorate their edit suites. And the back walls of the edit suites, so the wall behind the monitor, and these were color accurate grading monitors, so these were finishing suites for delivering programs to transmission. That several of the editors had these back walls decorated different colours, and this chap could tell which suite a program had come out of by the colour it was graded to. So the one suite which had a yellow back wall, of course the editor, his eyes were being pulled in the yellow direction, and so he was tending to grade everything in the blue direction. And it's a very genuine effect. And you talk to people who are serious about setting up colour accurate rooms for grading in, and that back wall has to be painted to a neutral colour, ideally 6504 Kelvin, and even the bulbs that illuminate that back wall for a bit of kind of reference have to be 6504 coloured fluorescent tubes. So it's something that people take very seriously. In fact, I don't know if you recall the Tektronix 601 WFM scopes, which were, they were everywhere throughout all the 90s. Tektronix produced a special edition version of that scope that had illuminant D phosphors, so that the green screen of a traditional CRT waveform monitor wouldn't pull the grader man's eyes away from peak white.
It used to worry me when we first got Pogles with 3 coloured balls.
Yes.
I thought, hello, what's going on here? What's this going to do? I mean, you can worry about it too much. Theoretically, before you sit down and do any colouring, you should let your eyes settle. You shouldn't smoke. You shouldn't have gone outside into the daylight. And there's a lot actually that goes on in the noodle that will affect your colour perception. But hey, I don't know how many colourists have to go into preparation before they start work. However, they should.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So the other sort of human perception, which again is for most people is very relative, is perception of audio. So most people, when they hear a tune, they can tell whether the tune is correct because they hear the intervals between the notes. But most people can't tell you whether it's in the same key that they heard it last time. If you're an amateur guitarist like me, if you pick up a guitar, you bash out a song, probably in whatever key you feel like playing, probably the key that has the fewest bar chords, and that's great. But some people have what they call perfect pitch, and they can tell, and those people tend to gravitate towards being musicians, and they can tell if the song they're hearing is in a different key to the first time they heard it, and they can tell you, oh yeah, that's a D sharp, that note. Most people just hear a note, but they can tell you what the note is. So it's reckoned that about 1 in 100 people have got perfect pitch. It's reckoned that about 1 in 10,000 people have got perfect colour memory. 1 in 10,000 people can actually really, really, really remember a colour. So most of the colourists you have to deal with probably don't have perfect colour memory, even though they probably believe they do. And I think with most client-facing jobs in television, actually the really good guys are those who are really good with the clients. And
I think so.
There's one particular colorist who, he's a big name guy. You see his name on the end of quite a lot of programs. Who we've done some work for. We set up a grading room for him at Pinewood Studios, and just the nicest bloke. And I think the reason why he's a good colorist is because he's a nice bloke.
Yes.
Not because he's particularly a colour scientist. That's the expression you hear a lot nowadays, colour scientist.
Indeed. Well, having worked out how much the brain is involved in perceiving colour, then having somebody who can perceive people and make those things work is a really essential part of the mix, really. So there we are. That's the basics of how the eye sees light. The problem between how the eye sees it and how we're able to detect it using our still rather old-fashioned and crude electronic tri-stimulus equipment and how we reproduce it. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is actually the science of reproduction.
Yes, indeed. So this podcast is the groundwork for our next one, which is calibrating monitors, which the people who do it for a living make quite a good living out of it, and I'm amazed that I do it quite a lot, and I'm amazed that we can charge the amount we do. But I think some people still take it seriously, some people still value it, and we're in the very fortunate position that not a lot of people do it anymore. So whereas when you and I started out, Hugh, every engineer was expected to calibrate monitors because the monitors were so blinking unreliable. If you're renting out an edit suite for many hundreds of pounds an hour, the client expected those monitors to have been calibrated this morning.
I've got some lovely stories about that. I'll let you into one. No, when we do the next one, I'll tell you the story.
Jolly good. Okay, well, we'll say goodbye, and we'll catch you next time for monitor calibration.
Thanks, Phil.